Hello and welcome. I'm Stuart Wolpert. It's nice to see all of you. Last June in this room, Professor Jared Diamond gave a lecture, and during the Q&A, somebody asked him what his thoughts are on AI, and he said he didn't know anything about AI. So today we thought we'd bring you two scholars who know quite a lot about AI. Christopher Kelty is a UCLA professor in the Institute for Society and Genetics, and in the departments of Information Studies and Anthropology. He's also director of the Livescu Initiative on Neuro, Narrative, and AI. We're happy to have you here. And Daniel Snelson is a UCLA assistant professor of English and Design Media Arts. He's a member of the Digital Humanities program and a writer, editor, and archivist. Dr. Snelson teaches in a very interesting English course about AI literature, and he's writing a book on how technology is transforming our access to knowledge. And we'll get into those a little bit later. So please join me in welcoming Christopher Kelty and Daniel Snelson. So it seems to me that artificial intelligence offers both tremendous benefits and also enormous costs. So let me start by asking you, are you excited about AI? Are you terrified by AI, or both? And how should we view AI?
I'll jump in. I've got a attitude with this, which is to just take the word excited a little bit literally. And I think, like in the way that our physiological systems become excited when there's something dangerous on the horizon, like a kind of like fight or flight syndrome. You know what I mean? Like I'm not quite sure. I think that I'm continuously in this state of fight or flight, where I don't quite know, is this something to be excited about in a way that embraces it and embraces its creative potentials, embraces its potential for research, embraces the sheer innovation that goes into AI, or if I should just be horrified about the ways it is transforming our planet with massive compute, the way it's being mobilized by militaries, financial systems, medical systems, where all of our futures are being written by these systems we don't quite understand. So that's my shortest answer to that question.
I'm definitely excited in the same way. I come at this in some ways as a historian, a little bit, a historian of science and technology. This is one part of my training. And we take a somewhat longer view of it, and if you've been watching the development of technology over many years, the question really becomes, how much more terrifying is this than the last time we were really terrified? Or how much more excited should I be than the last time I was really excited? And then that becomes a little bit of an easier question to answer because you have things to compare to, right?
So what is the answer to that?
Well, I think I'm more terrified of AI than I was of, say, the advent of the internet in the 90s, right? I was much more excited about the advent of the internet, and I'm more terrified about AI. And I think the reason for that is that they're actually quite closely connected to each other, and some of the things that were bad about the internet are bad about AI, and some of the things that are good about the internet may not actually be on the horizon with AI.
So let's talk about both some of these tremendous benefits and costs. So benefits, it seems to me for health, there are absolutely enormous benefits, diagnosing and treating disease. Now, perhaps AI can help us find solutions to future pandemics, maybe to climate change, maybe it can help us reduce energy consumption, to name a few. On the other hand, AI-generated fraud and misinformation threaten democracy, and AI seems very likely to produce new ways to harass and bully people, to mislead people, to spread hate. So how are you viewing these costs and benefits? How we can kind of get the best of the benefits and protect ourselves from the costs?
Oh,
that's a big question.
Such a big question. It's true. I've been very excited. Just recently there was a report about how AI is being used to develop new materials for batteries that are more optimal. That material scientists, it's quite difficult to come up with these, but AI has been able to generate some hundreds of new materials quite quickly. So there are these kinds of promises, or genomic breakthroughs, or these really difficult big questions. But I think that I like the way you phrase this question in terms of thinking about the cost as well. This is where I think, I'm not a historian, and I'm not a scientist, I'm a literary scholar and a poet. And here's where I think there's still an argument for poetry and the arts that, as a media theorist Marshall McLuhan and I returned to, said, the arts are advanced probes into emerging technology. So there's ways in which I think the poetry and the arts are able to think about the ambivalence or this kind of like difficult relationship between cost and benefit in emerging technologies. And it's, you know, in the way that Keats would talk about the negative capability of a poem, where you can say a rose is beautiful, but it's beautiful because it dies. And so a rose is both its death and its beauty at the same time. This is why I think poetry is really good at speaking to AI systems, which are all pharmacons, right? They are both poison and cure. And so, yeah, I think that's how I've been thinking about it. It's more about the alignment of cost and benefit in the same, and sometimes in the same word, maybe in a home.
Is AI like a rose? Or maybe something more scary than a rose?
Yeah, AI helps us to think about our planet as a rose.
Yeah.
Or humanity maybe as a rose.
I think one of the ways I sort out the good and bad things actually is where is AI being used, and you know who's using it. And in the sciences, I think there's this tremendous potential because it fits into a process of discovery that is very highly structured. It's very organized. The way we ask questions, pose hypotheses, keep data in doing scientific work is really very highly structured, and AI fits into that by doing a lot of the grunt work that would otherwise take humans a lot of time to do. And in that case, it's very exciting because it really can lead to the kinds of advances you're talking about. Protein folding problems, for instance, are a really great use case for AI, where it's a really difficult thing to figure out how a protein folds, and humans have spent hours and hours and PhDs upon PhDs figuring out individual proteins. An AI properly trained on all that previous work can do amazing guesstimation about what a protein ought to look like, and scientists can ask, is that a good one to test?
And it's so much faster.
And it's so much faster. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure about implementing artificial intelligence, at the counter of the airlines, where we no longer have a human to help you get on the plane, and the AI doesn't really know who you are or care who you are. So those use cases to me seem the places where I'm terrified as opposed to excited.
I'm excited about AI's benefits for health, but I'm concerned about the threats of misinformation, threats to democracy. So in a world of deep fakes, videos that look real but are not real, how will people know what's real, what they can trust, what they can believe?
I feel like that's a Daniel Snelson question here. When is poetry real? Right?
I think that's, I think the answer that maybe if I'm inhabiting the voice of poetry or art, I think that the true answer is that you just won't be able to. That we're quickly on the space.
That's terrifying.
I think, well, it's a transformation, and I think this is, goes back to Chris's comments about the internet that just thoroughly transformed the way that we navigate the world, the way we see ourselves. GPS changed the way we see ourselves on a map. But I think, really, already it's very difficult to tell certain forms of writing.
Right.
And increasingly it's impossible to tell. You used to be able to tell that it was AI because there were one too many fingers. You might see this, right? It just didn't do fingers well, but gasp, now it's really good at fingers, right? And it used to be that AI couldn't do letter forms very well, so you could see if there was an AI generated image of a library, you could tell it was AI generated because the titles of the books would all be garbled. But now the new GPT-4o, which was just released last week, it does letters really well. So I think we'll keep seeing these incremental adjustments that produce these reality effects.
Sure.
And I think increasingly it's going to be about what channels you can trust, how did an image or a text come to be, and I think it will require us to think about new mechanisms of validating the information we bring into our lives.
Yeah, one of the things that we do when new technologies come out is actually learn how to use them and learn how to adjust to them and adapt to them. So at some level the question becomes, what's the proper speed of introduction of the new technologies, right? What's the rate at which humans can learn to live with a new technology before the next one replaces it, right? And that's really where we're at with seeing these updates and everything coming so fast to us. So.
Right, so what you're saying about how AI keeps improving reminds me that in the early 1990s, supercomputers lost in chess to grandmasters before they started beating them, but by the later 90s, they didn't lose.
Yeah, I know AI is really good at Minecraft and Fortnite and all these other really complicated video games.
So What is distinctly human these days? Thinking analytically seems not to be distinctly human. Is creativity unique to humans?
It's an ongoing question. I think, in the arts, we have a long history of thinking about automated processes of creative production, right? Going back to Dadaism in Germany in the 19-teens and 20s, where an artist could say, point at a urinal that had been mass-produced and say, this is an artwork. Or famously, Moholy-Nagy would call into factories and give them instructions and say, make a metal sheet that has yellow, red, and white rectangles. And then the factory would produce that artwork. And so we've been thinking about this question of automation in at least the avant-garde arts since over the last century. So in some ways, the answer that we've come to, the conclusion, sorry to get back to your question, about where creativity lies is really just who does the pointing and who calls the work of art a work of art. And increasingly, if automated systems are better at pointing at things and calling them works of art, then I think that will challenge our sense of where creativity lies.
Andy Warhol defined art as anything you can get away with.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's really, quite right. And I think, we can also think about just the advent of technologies like photography, which completely transformed what our definition of creativity was, right? At the beginning, photography was seen as this automated process that just captured the world, and there was, in similar ways, I think to right now, a great deal of consternation and teeth gnashing around the role of what we now call arts and crafts. People who used to make etchings for newspapers as like public record, or portraits of nobles as like representational images. Once photography came around, art didn't have the same function, and society very quickly changed the way it viewed creativity to incorporate these new automated techniques.
One of the things that I think a lot of people are struggling with around creativity and artificial intelligence is that this generation of what we're calling artificial intelligence, which is machine learning, it works because it takes massive amounts of data, it forms models of how that data relates to itself, and then it uses that model to produce new things that represent the relationships in that data. So a lot of this is when you hear people say, oh, it's just really good at predicting the next word, right? That's how it forms a sentence, right? Is that it predicts what's the most likely next word, right? But this raises a very interesting question about both human and AI creativity. It's like, is that how human creativity works, right? Is it the fact that we manage to just juxtapose a lot of things in our brain and somehow out of that pops an idea that we then grab and turn into something that we can use? So it's possible that we're learning a lot about at least a circumscribed form of human creativity by playing around with these tools and seeing whether or not they're created in the same way as we think.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting reversal of that question, and I've been so inspired by Chris's work in this, which is instead of thinking how do machines think, that these new automated modes of thinking forces us to think about how humans think. And there's a real opportunity and I think every new technology gives us a new opportunity to see ourselves more clearly via whatever kind of technical metaphor it provides us.
And related to that, would you say that with AI, thinking is no longer unique to humans and animals? And if so, what are the implications of AI and non-human thinking?
So it's interesting that you mentioned animals there, because I think we actually are really in a moment in the sciences that deal with animal behavior and learning a lot about how animals think. For a long time, and especially in certain strands of philosophy, animals were not granted any capacity to think. And we now have all kinds of evidence that they think in all kinds of really creative ways, and that they can do all kinds of things that we never assumed they could do before. So at the same time that we're exploring what it is that a human does when it thinks, or a machine does when it thinks, we're also exploring that with animals. And I think it's really breaking open this category and asking us to come up with very new theories about what thinking is in general. It's not just something confined to the human brain, but to some set of relationships between the brain and the rest of the environment that it inhabits, the brain and its history.
And what are you saying about AI and thinking? Will AI simply sort through enormous quantities of databases and then kind of spit out an answer, or is AI actually thinking?
Well, so that's an open question, let's just say. Right. I would hesitate to answer it once and for all here. But what's interesting about the question, I suppose, is how would we know, right? How would we know if it's actually thinking? And that is itself a kind of recursive question. What does it mean for humans to think about this? Right? Could I come up with a really creative, theory of what it's doing in order to convince you that it's thinking. Well, that would be a human thinking about what it's doing. Right?
Well, one thing AI could possibly do is create its own language that we don't understand.
Sure.
If it does that, then the AI might decide they don't need you.
Could happen.
Could happen.
Yeah, I'm not super convinced by that scenario.
That's good. That's good.
Oh, well, I would just add there's a really fascinating article in the New York Times, I think just last week, on Anthropy, which is, so for a long time we've thought these AI systems have been black boxes. They've been just kind of, we don't know how they're working on the inside, and so increasingly researchers, and Anthropy is one of these companies, have been trying to reverse engineer the thought process. And it's giving us some really, I was kind of thinking about you, Chris, I was reading about the grandma cell, you know, which is, I think it's like used to teach philosophy of consciousness, but it's been widely debunked, in human thought at least, which is that there's like one point in your brain, there's like a cell that can both recognize the word grandma and would also light up if you saw a picture of your grandma,
Wow.
or you saw like a drawing of a grandma.
Wow.
And so like we have since learned that our human brains don't do that. However, Anthropy has found that AI does exactly this. So it actually has grandma cells that recognize words, images, sounds, and other representations congruently. It lights up the same point in the network.
That's remarkable.
So there's this like test of what makes us human that's like slightly different, but we're learning more about how it thinks, which you know, in its own internal language, which, as we know, is multidimensional and just kind of impossible, even for data scientists to track.
And Dr. Snelson, a question for you. Comedy seems distinctly human, but in a recent competition between a human comedian and AI, the human lost every round. Comedy often requires emotional intelligence. Does AI have that?
It has emotional. Here's how I would answer this. So I think that there's sometimes we think about AI as this kind of like alien entity that has just arrived like at our feet and started spitting things at us. But you know, all these systems, they're built out of human data. They're built out of arts. They're built out of thousands upon thousands of comedy routines. They're built out of, say, one of my favorite AI. There's a Twitch called Nothing Forever, which is a 24-hour stream of Seinfeld episodes. And it just running continues because it's so formulaic, it kind of works. And it's so funny. It's a hilarious thing. No one's at the wheel. The AI is just running, but it's running out of human data. So the emotional intelligence that these systems have are built out of the way that we have tried to represent our own emotional intelligence. We've done that in novels, we've done that in TV shows, we've done that in movies, and we've done that in vast quantities on websites like Reddit. And these are the data streams that AI is pulling from. So whatever it gives us, it is it's pointing a distorted mirror back at us, I think.
I mean, it seems to me that AI can produce pulp fiction, but can AI produce really high quality fiction? Can AI make humans laugh and cry?
So I'll share the first time that AI made me cry.
Wow.
I didn't think that it would. I read a lot of, I do this for my job, I read a lot of stories. There's one story by Barbarini Ibarra called Ghosts. It was published in The Believer magazine a few years ago, where she uses AI to write about something she's never been able to write about, which is the death of her sister at a young age from childhood leukemia. And she just hasn't been able to, wanted to write about it, but she couldn't. And so she starts, and I think it's the problem of like a blank page, but she starts by prompting GPT to write the story for her. So she says, I have this sister, she's ill, and then she has the GPT continue the story, and it gets it totally wrong. And then so she's like, no, that's not how it happened. But then she tells the GPT a little bit more, like, no, my sister actually died, and here's what happened next. And then the GPT finishes the story. And it goes through like 9 iterations where you see, and here's why it's beautiful, I think you see this author navigating this traumatic event from her past in dialogue and in conversation with this automated agent. And by the end of it, I was just like weeping. Fully weeping. And so I think it has to do with, and this goes back to what Chris is saying, a revised sense of what a story is. Maybe a good AI story is not the traditional novel, but something that's a bit more give and take.
Yeah,
in the sense that
it's interesting because that's a collaboration too, what produced that. And I think part of our mistake is to think that we always have to talk about this as AI or human. In almost all cases where it's actually doing really interesting things, it's in collaboration with humans. The humans are figuring out how to use it in interesting and creative ways. And so that's a different entity than just AI doing it on its own versus humans doing it on their own.
And as we know, humans have never written on their own. No Man's an Island. Books are like very networked things that involve conversations, intertextual references to other novels, often cut and paste copying even.
Even reading is like that. You make these relationships with characters in novels that transcend the novel, right? They become things that tell you how to live your life or what you would do in a certain situation.
That the author may not even intend.
Exactly.
Yeah. So is there advice you give to artists and writers who are considering incorporating AI into their work?
Yeah, I generally, I taught this class this past fall called Algo-Lit, an introduction to AI literature. And on the first session of this class, we collectively wrote a book together using AI that was the history of algorithmic literature as told by artificial intelligence from the year 2063. So before the students had studied anything about AI, I was like, okay, we're just gonna prompt, tell AI that it's a literary historian and it's reflecting on what AI literature has done.
Interesting.
And so we invented this future history before we had studied anything. But the thing that made it work, and this is the advice I give to all the students in my class, is to try to come up with frameworks that enable us to see something that was otherwise invisible. Whether that's some aspect of a platform, whether that's some aspect of our global situation, or it's some existential aspect of what it means to be human. At each of these points, if you can prompt these automated systems to help us see something that was otherwise invisible, then I think you've done something important. And I think that applies to both art and scholarship.
That's a very innovative course. Tell us more about that and what the students learned from it.
Our quarter system is so rapid fire. We have these 10 condensed weeks, right? And so in this past fall, there were huge transformations to the field of AI. There was scandals with Sam Altman and OpenAI. They had just released the new video generator Sora. They introduced Suno. The class worked week by week from text to image to sound to video. And we were both making databases of all of the tools that were emerging while experimenting with those tools and seeing what other artists were doing. But the class had to change week by week because the technological landscape was just changing so quickly. I imagined, and Chris has done a lot of work on the history of the internet, but I've imagined it's how do you teach the internet in 1993 when it's changing so quickly?
Sure.
So,
Absolutely. Preparing for this discussion, there's news about AI every day. Today, there's news that OpenAI is saying that Russia and China are using its technology for propaganda campaigns. That was just on the Washington Post an hour ago. Okay, so an issue in last year's SAG and WGA strikes concerned AI, where writers and actors are concerned about AI replacing writers' words and actors' images. Will AI, it seems like AI is going to cost a lot of jobs. Will AI displace people in creative jobs? Or are you saying that it'll do both? People will lose jobs, but also there'll be collaborations and it may help create jobs as well?
I think that jobs just change. I think that, and I really, with this, I'm saying this is neither in an optimistic or a doomerist way, but our relationship to knowledge and cultural production will change dramatically.
Sure.
And we saw how dramatically even something like a word processor changed our relationship to text when you didn't have to type things out on a keyboard. And you could actually move words around. It changed our thoughts. It changed our writing tools are always working on our thoughts. So, in some ways you can look back to the history of, again, the return to photography, that there were a whole bunch of representational arts that were put out of business, say, by the invention of photography. But that also meant that there were a lot of new photographers that were taking photographs. And I think in the same way for many of us, there'll be parts of our jobs that change. We were just talking about certain kinds of administrative functions that I don't want to have to do. Not the core part of my job as a scholar and a poet, but maybe an automated system's going to help me do that. And so I think it's going to be a really dramatic transformation. I don't know if you have thoughts.
No, I agree with that, and I think in the SAG strike in particular, it's interesting to think about what it was. One of the things that they were striking about was actually the arrival of this new form of creating content, which is the streaming services, right? Prior to this, if we either had television in a relatively structured way or we went to the theater for a movie, and streaming really changed all the economics around that. And as a result, also changed the jobs around that and changed them for the better for a lot of people. And so AI is now threatening something which was itself a massive transformation of the way that the industry was producing content. And so I think if you put it in a slightly larger context, you can see how these jobs are constantly changing. I mean, I think what people are really worried about in these contexts is like, will AI be used to do a dumber version of what I do? Without me, yeah, and then get paid for it.
That's right.
Nobody really wants that.
That's right.
But that's why I think at these moments, it's like an important moment to advocate for, like, and to imagine, like, what would a good work week look like? You know? Like, what is fair pay for the kind of work I do? And because these things are changing so dramatically, rather than say, like, ban AI, like, that's not quite pop like that. Pandora's box has been opened. It's a chance to really try to reevaluate the radical politics of what is it that I do as a culture producer, and how is that valued by my audience and by my patrons and by my institutions.
And I think a lot of people sense this immediately because right as soon as AI really broke open, you saw the emergence of this new category of this new job that was called prompt engineer, right? And it became very clear to a lot of people very quickly that there was a way to become a professional in the use of AI, and that might be the future, right? Now, the book is still open on this one, but definitely people recognize that because the box is open, we got to figure out how to use it, and so there's a lot of questions about what that looks like in the future.
So tell us more about how you expect AI to impact art, literature, and music. Another big question.
How it will impact? I want to, like, maybe just keep carrying this conversation where I think it really does impact our sense of what these genres are, and these genres are changing and moving really quickly. I'll step back for a second. So my background is in experimental poetry and writing, and I was always drawn to that because there was this play with form and media, and it's artists really trying to push the boundaries of what these genres are and what our expectations for the art forms are in general. And increasingly I've seen that energy moving into video games, mostly because like video games don't have, like unlike serial television or the novel, like a video game can be many different things, right? It's a platformer or a first-person shooter or a collectible game or a life simulator, and some of them are 100 hours long, some of them are 1,000 hours long, and some of them are, one of my favorite games is 10 seconds long. And so, you know, like there's this like wild array of forms that people are using to produce these like mediated digital objects. They are like, they're making it up as they go along. And I think that some of our older forms, poetry, the novel, the movie, right? We have these genres that have been pretty stable for the last 50 to 100 years. In the case of the novel, the last 200, 300 years. I think those are going to change. Like, I think that they have to grow and become more flexible in the same way that these other formats, I think the internet and digital formats have had to be very flexible in terms of there's things you can do in a 10-second story that you can't do in a 1,000-hour story. And how do you play to a 10-second story versus a 1,000-hour story? I think the same question can be applied to how do you use certain kinds of AI systems to tell meaningful stories in and across these different types of genres.
And how about music? There's a new song by the Beatles who broke up half a century ago.
Yeah, I don't like that song very much.
I don't like that song.
It's not actually written by AI. It's like they just remastered a part of the song that John Lennon had recorded that was like poorly recorded. There are some songs I do love. There's a song where Kurt Cobain sings a song by Lana Del Rey that was recorded some 30 years after his death. And the song is called Young and Beautiful. It's another thing that made me cry.
Oh, I know that song.
Yeah, Young, it's a beautiful song, but like the Kurt Cobain AI voice that they used is so perfect.
Oh.
And so you like have this, you know, along with the birth of photography, you had things like spiritualism and seances, that like new technologies make us feel a little bit spooky about what it means to be a human. And I had that same spooky feeling when I heard like perfectly Kurt Cobain singing this song about being young forever. It was brand new. Wow. So like that gave me chills.
I heard that, but I know the song. So Kurt Cobain is singing "Will You Still Love Me When I'm No Longer Young and Beautiful."
Yeah.
Wow.
It's really good, right?
Yeah, I mean, this actually pushes us a little bit too into this domain of you know, issues around ownership of the voice, copyright. You know, how are these things being managed from the perspective of the law, right? And I think, you know, the questions about creativity and whether or not AI can produce art and whatnot are one thing, but how we'll manage that and how we'll to treat that is also a really important part of the story, and that has been the part of music and film and all the way along, right? These questions of the rights of the author, the copyright, the commercialization of art, all sorts of. So I think we'll, if we're willing to sort of remember a little bit some of the things we went through with previous media and with other kinds of examples, we might have some tools for thinking about what will likely happen in this case as well. So.
Next, I want to ask you about education, where again it seems to me that there are enormous benefits and enormous costs. So it seems like students could interact with historical figures through AI, which sounds wonderful, maybe even with literary characters, which sounds fascinating. Students could have AI tutors, maybe everyone would have a customized knowledge assistant. Again, that sounds wonderful. But it also makes cheating much easier and much harder to detect. How do you see AI impacting education?
I mean, this is something we talk about all the time, obviously, here at the university, because we're trying to solve it as it's being built. Right?
I'm on 3 different committees about this question.
Yeah. So, I mean, the positive things are really interesting, and I do think there is a real opportunity here for, especially those fields where learning is very clearly organized. So I think in the sciences, especially in mathematics at the lower levels, you really do have a step language learning. You really have a sort of step-by-step way in which you move through the process of learning these things. And really good AI tutors could do a lot of good there, especially at a place like UCLA where we are admitting more and more students every day and not really hiring a lot more people like Danny and I to educate them. And so the question is, how are they going to learn a lot, especially a lot of the basic stuff? So I think that's an important part. And the cheating thing is the flip side of that, right? The more students you have, the less one-on-one engagement you have, the more you open up the possibility for cheating and for people to sort of game the system in new ways. And I mean, I have thoughts about it, but I don't have any solutions. I haven't heard any good ones yet.
What about
your committee come up with anything?
It's very case by case. I think it does change how we evaluate what kinds of deliverables we have our students give us in these classes in terms of output. But I think what really needs to happen is just a retraining of how our students are engaging with these systems, that they are very helpful tutors. They're very helpful mentors. They're very helpful conversants. Laurie Anderson, her partner Lou Reed, famous musician, after he passed, she has an AI Lou Reed that apparently she's talked about in reports that she spends multiple hours a day just talking to Lou Reed, AI Lou Reed, which is amazing. And our students can do the same thing. They can talk to the novels they're studying. They can talk to the philosophers they're studying. There are a lot of opportunities for this, but it changes. It's not so much about. I think right now our students are just thinking, how can I use this to write a 5-paragraph essay? Which is probably the dumbest way to use this.
Oh, that's so interesting. So you could talk with Abraham Lincoln, or I was a philosophy major, you could talk to Socrates or Aristotle?
Of course, yeah.
That's
I mean, just train on those data, and then there's a platform called Character AI that already does this. You can put 4 or 5 of them in a room. There was a reverse Turing test that was just released this week, where there's a room of 6 AI agents and 1 human. And the AI agents had to figure out which one was the human. And they did it. They were really good at it. One of them was Aristotle. I think Aristotle was the first one to call it the human. So there are these creative ways, but I think it's changing how we think about how we engage with knowledge and changing how we teach our students to engage. We want them to learn, we want them to think critically, and there are many ways to do that outside of the standard essay. The standard essay, I think, has to I don't think it's going to have the same life that it's had as a stable genre over the last few hundred years.
I mean, one of the terrifying outcomes of something like that is a situation where you say, okay, well, just talk to the Abraham Lincoln AI, don't bother me, right? Because what you really want is go talk to the AI, Abraham Lincoln, and then come talk to me, the historian, who will tell you something about your conversation with the AI, Abraham Lincoln. So, what we don't want is to go down the road where we're like, oh, we finally found people that could teach all the undergraduates. We don't need the faculty anymore. That's not the route we need to go down. And I'm not just saying that because my job's on the line here, but it really does have an impact on education if you can't go back and forth between the tool and the human, right? If you can't, there is still something about that back and forth that's a really important part of education.
So tell us more about that, because obviously that's an issue in secondary schools and high schools, and it's an issue here at UCLA. Tell us more about the different levels of education and AI.
Well, I think so this was something that I I come up against in a lot of my classes, which are critical, creative, hybrid classes. They're often looking at emerging technologies and creative formats. With the case of AI in particular, and in all these classes, I find it really flips, to use like a standard term, like it really flips the sense of what the classroom does. But the classroom is a place to like cohabit embodied, to like be bodies in space together. So it's like, it's really fun to play a board game in person. It's not so fun to play that online. And so there's certain things you can do online. I think that the pandemic really taught us a lot of these tools. There's certain things that online teaching is really good at. Like I have much more fun in my video games classes, teaching my classes inside of Minecraft or Fortnite, because like we can talk about the system that we're studying while we're inside of that same system. And so it's thinking about what are the affordances of shared space and what kinds of skills does one need to navigate these shared spaces, to have like improvisational conversations and read body language and reply on the spot to difficult critical questions. And these are all things that we can really just lean into the specific affordances of what we do as embodied humans, which aren't, again, going to go away anytime soon, I don't think. And so there's a real value in thinking about the classroom as like a shared meeting space for the production of knowledge, the production of creativity, and for developing critical perspectives.
Most of what we do with AI now is actually just staring at a screen, right? It's not, that's what makes, in a lot of cases, the emotional connection of embodied beings talking to one another. But then, of course, this raises the question of whether or not, once you instantiate the AI in a robot that has very distinctive and very recognizable movements and gestures that feel like it's human, right? You can imagine a path down which you go where the room is filled with robots instead of with humans. And maybe it's not so important. Maybe at some level we do need to figure out how to emotionally connect with non-human entities, right? Like that's a thing we need to develop. But we don't want to lose track of that, and we don't want to lose track of why we're doing that. And I think once you start replacing humans because you're like, oh, this is going to, I don't know what the theory is, it's going to free us up to do more work, do something else on the weekend, right? But once you lose track of why it is you're doing what you're doing, then you've kind of lost the game there.
Yeah. Well, I just want to add also, just like the old adage, right, that like, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog.
That's right.
Right? You can put on any kind of skin, you can present any kind of way, and I think, as we see again and again, I think like the real embodied aspect of like identity, of race, of gender, like the ways in which we express these types of performances are deeply important to like making the world better, to having a better understanding of the diversity of voices that surround us. Where online, it can feel like one homogenous voice, or they can get distilled into radicalized ideological perspectives. And I think it's these shared spaces where we're able to see the complexity and the messiness of being like embodied humans.
So far, people seem to use AI mostly to get answers to questions. You ask Siri or you ask Alexa something. What happens when people not only use AI to provide information, but also have AI take actions on their behalf?
Yeah, it's already happening. Like, you can get ChatGPT to make a restaurant reservation for you. That's pretty easy.
Well, that's pretty not.
That's not so bad, right? But AI is also making decisions about, for example, how much insurance costs. It's already making decisions about like who gets certain types of medical treatment. It's making real decisions about who lives or dies in ongoing wars. So these are like active things that like these are automated agents that are making decisions for us already in the background. And so one of the something I'm hopeful for is that the more we have these conversations about AI and thinking about how these automated agents that extend beyond us are making decisions on our behalf that we might not agree with, it helps us to see these other larger infrastructures that digital culture has, like, that have been operating, these algorithms that have been operating over the last 20 or 30 years, which are having huge impacts on our lives and are really hard to see. That somehow, like, engagement with AI helps us maybe to see these very powerful algorithms a bit more clearly.
Yeah. There's a book that I like a lot that's by the British political theorist David Runciman. I think it's called The Handover. And it's actually a book about states and corporations, because he's a political theorist of states and corporations. And he makes the case that states and corporations are essentially sort of a version of what humans are, but super powerful. And so in that sense, we kind of see examples of what AI left to make decisions on its own might look like. Well, states and corporations make a lot of decisions for us on their own, as it were. right? And we're constantly obsessed with trying to figure out how to locate responsibility or locate blame in those larger superhuman entities. So I think we do have to ask ourselves the question, if you want AI to go out and do something on your behalf, make decisions for you, do you want it to look like the states and corporations that we currently have, right? Is that a good model for how we would let something make decisions on our behalf? And there's definitely good and bad answers, or good and bad outcomes there.
And who decides?
Well, that's the question you ask when a corporation does something, who decides, right? In the end of the day, we say it's the CEO's choice or whatever, but we all know that lots of decisions happen inside a corporation to make something happen. Same with states, governments. So really understanding how that responsibility works in those cases would be a lot of help to people who are asking, should AI be allowed to make decisions here or there?
AI can calculate 1 million times faster than humans, and that will increase. So I want to ask you about AI in the military. If wars can be fought with robot soldiers instead of human soldiers, I think countries are more likely to start wars and keep wars going. So a couple of questions. Can we trust AI to make decisions about escalating a war? And how much autonomy, if any, should AI have to launch weapons?
That's just no.
Yeah, no.
Just no to both of those. And also I would just say that, what I like about the question though is that this is already happening, right? The drone warfare has been the dominant mode of 21st century warfare, and whether that's played with by a teenager with a controller or just an auto targeting system, then it's the same idea. And increasingly we're seeing AI-based decisions over who gets struck that are, I think, incredibly concerning and something that we should be actively thinking about and actively, I think, working against.
Yeah, well said.
Should we be worried about AI terrorists? That's the subject of a new movie called Atlas.
You mean the AI is a terrorist?
AI is a terrorist.
How is it different than AI warfare? In some ways, it's a question of whether or not you're attributing some sort of ideological.
Well, in one case, AI is acting on behalf of a country or a government. In the other case, they're acting on their own. Maybe instead of the U.S. versus Russia or China, it's humans versus AI.
So at the root of the question you're asking is in some ways how much control are we going to have as humans over these things, whether it's in the military or under, And so the terrorist case implies that there's a kind of out of control AI somehow, but it's still under people's control. Just like prompt engineering or figuring out how to use it to write a novel, military planners, engineers have to figure out what they want it to do, right? And I think that's not a question that's normally in the public domain, right? It's not a question that we read as much as we ought to about in the newspaper, but that preparation for war, that planning for war that goes into designing AI technologies that might be used in a drone, for instance, it is in fact part of the war, right? We're doing that as we design it. It's not just a weapon that can be used for any purpose. It's a weapon that can be used in particular ways to do particular things, and that's an ongoing discussion for sure.
And we've already seen, aside from the actual real physical harms of drone warfare, there's also information war, there's propaganda, there's all kinds of ways in which these things are, again, already happening. And I think we also have, this is where I think speculative fiction is kind of useful. So we have a huge archive of movies where we've seen this go terribly wrong. Whether it's Galactica or Terminator or Her or any of these films, you can see how, at least as humans, we've been really fascinated by the idea of this kind of artificial alien other rising up, and I think that's why the word terrorist maybe is it's just an other, right? It's an other kind of power. But this other rises up and changes everything, maybe destroys all of us. And there are as many different kinds of sci-fi scenarios, I think, as there are imaginative writers and filmmakers. And so I am interested in how we might, when thinking about these questions, return to these aesthetic forms, which hopefully give us some answers, because they've been playing out scenarios almost like simulators over and over and over again. And most of the time it has a bad outcome.
And do you want to share your thoughts on Her and any of these other movies that you just mentioned?
I think one, rather than Her, I would turn, there's a video game called Detroit Become Human, which I really recommend. It's not a hard game to play, it's a story-based game where you just make selections. And it's, you can either become, it's like you play as these AI androids in the game. And over the course of the game, you make all kinds of branching choices that either you can lead a peaceful revolution of like AI and human integration, or you can just like burn down all of society. and what's amazing about the video game is that it tests you every step of the way. Like you keep making choices, and to get to the peaceful resolution, it's the hardest possible outcome in the game. Like it's really difficult to navigate political factions, ethical considerations, scientists, lobbyists, and so on, to get to this peaceful resolution of humans and AI. It's like the least likely outcome, right? But I think that the game models that whole decision tree really beautifully, and I felt like I learned a lot about what that might look like.
That's interesting. What is that game called?
Detroit Become Human.
Detroit Become Human. Interesting. When it came to the dangers of genetic engineering, scientists agreed more than 40 years ago not to proceed quickly with research. But that doesn't happen with AI, and trillions of dollars are at stake, which means the incentive is to rush, not to be cautious. And so, I mean, won't AI become a race where everyone wants to be first, and, you know, Russia and China and Iran, and where everybody's racing, and you don't have the safeguards?
Yeah, this is an interesting comparison, because what you're referring to, the famous moratorium on recombinant DNA at Asilomar, was really actually possible because there was a very small number of people who really knew how recombinant DNA worked, and they could literally all meet in California on the beach and decide that they were going to slow things down. That's a remarkable moment in the history of science, and it's a really interesting story. What's happened with artificial intelligence in the last few years is actually something that you have to understand in the context of how the internet exploded in the 90s and early 2000s, which is through open source software, free software, the ability for people to very easily obtain, tinker with, improve, and then re-release software of various sorts. And so we live in a world now which is, from the get-go, already very easily available to just any tinkerer who wants to start playing with it. And so there's actually literally no way you can even imagine the most powerful people being in the room to say we shouldn't do AI at this point, maybe some other route by which one can tinker with these things. So we need a different kind of solution. I think when you saw OpenAI go fully closed in the last couple of years, they were trying to figure out how to become that kind of person, to become the Manhattan Project of artificial intelligence, and figure out who was going to do it, who wasn't going to do it. But there's a parallel story of all the tinkering going on with OpenAI models, with AI models that are just openly available on the internet. And that's one of the things that we don't have really clear and good regulatory systems for at a state level, at an international level. That's where we need to be thinking about it if we actually want to have any kind of control, for sure.
Very interesting.
And that discourse is changing really quickly. It's actually, you know, so about a year ago was this proposed moratorium, like the spring of 2023, was going to slow down AI. And recently, there was just a recent piece about how, you know, there used to be a big discourse around AI safety and what people would call existential risk, right? The existential risk of AI wiping out humanity. The same conversation we've just been having, that was a big part of the conversation in 2023 and 2022, and increasingly it's dropping off. Like the people are being laid off, the internal groups of AI safety or AI ethics, like those people are being laid off.
Yeah,
and I think,
how worried are you about that?
well, part of the issue I think is that when these things are reported a lot, that the public becomes, we kind of like accept it as part of our daily apocalyptic reality. So it's like, in some ways, like headline after headline warning about existential risk has somehow inured us to the actual urgency that these systems produce. And of course that's to the benefit of a variety of these corporations who can just continue exponentially developing AI without any safeguards, without any sense of like pacing.
And there are risks about climate change, destructive weather, nuclear war, and other things. So in a way, AI, it could be like, well, just add that to the list. You know, mass shootings.
And it's connected to a lot of these things. You know,
the psychology is how we're affected by it.
It's connected to information warfare on the internet. It's connected to climate in terms of its massive amounts of computation. It's connected to global economic structures in like nanosecond transactions and fintech. Right. So like there's no part of our global society that's not connected to this network. and that AI isn't playing a major role in transforming right now. So it's not just, on one hand, it's not just people writing screenplays who are going to be affected, right? Like it's the entire system.
That sounds quite frightening, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Well, I'll play the optimist here in some ways, because someone has to, or else we're all doomed. But so there are certain areas where I think we'll see more careful regulation. Medicine is a good example, actually, because so ChatGPT is already better at communicating with patients than most doctors, and most patients feel like they would rather talk to ChatGPT than their doctor for a couple of reasons. One is like the ChatGPT actually spends more time with you than the doctor will, and will actually also explain in great detail whatever it's trying to diagnose you with. So that's actually really valuable, but what people in medicine recognize is that it has to be validated. They're not going to implement that under existing regulation and also under just your basic Hippocratic oath, unless they can really replicate it and make sure that it's validatable, right? And there's a lot of people working on that with medicine. So because it's so valuable, people are figuring out a way to do it safely in that context. And I think there are certain areas where people are really doing that. Medicine, finance is probably another because there's money is at stake, but other areas, maybe not so much.
But with health, not only communication, a serious stroke can leave people unable to speak, and AI can allow them to communicate again. And that sounds absolutely marvelous. Dr. Snelson, tell us a bit about the book you're writing on technology and knowledge.
Oh, sure. It rhymes with, I think, some of my commentary here, where I've been thinking recently a lot about these different ways. Like we've accessed knowledge in one way for a very long time, just through libraries and what we would call now metadata, but really like classificatory systems and archives. And then we had a small period in the grand scheme of things from the 90s up until I think maybe a year or so ago, where we accessed all of our knowledge through algorithms, through search strings. And I've been doing research on, because I'm a poet at heart, the prosody of search strings. Like, what is the way in which we try to find things using Google search? And I think that's just being changed really dramatically right now. And it goes back to something Chris said earlier about prompt engineering, or I think the elevated currency form is to call it prompt craft. So I've been really interested in, and I think we've already seen Google's doing this, other search engines, also a whole number of collections are integrating AI into search systems. And it's a different way of thinking. So I feel like I came up training my brain to be really good at searching for things on algorithms. And I'm trying to think about what it means to retrain my brain and retrain my students' brains toward prompting, toward these kinds of conversational systems. And I've been finding answers in video games, but I'll spare you the details. But that's the big idea I'm trying to get at, and is that, at least from the creative side of things, that this all comes down to thinking about the interface of communication, the input that we as humans bring into AI, and how we prompt it to do things. And that's actually where the art is in finding ways to communicate and frames to communicate with emerging generative systems.
And when do you expect the book to be published?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, we'll look forward to it.
Hopefully not too long. I mean, it's hard to future-proof these things.
Okay.
Who knows where we'll be in 2 years.
And Dr. Kelty, tell us a bit about the initiative on Neuro, Narrative, and AI, which you're director, and if there's any research project you want to mention in addition.
Yeah, so I had a really lovely opportunity through a donor, Simona Livescu and the Livescu Foundation, to start this project, which originally was started as a kind of AI and society project, really focused on AI, and really focused on UCLA. She's a UCLA alum and has a PhD from UCLA, actually. But I explained that UCLA is actually not really the center for artificial intelligence. We're not Berkeley. We're not, sadly, in this respect, in many other respects, I'm sure we're doing fine. But we're not MIT. We're not Carnegie Mellon. We're not we have a few people who really do great work in AI. But we do have an enormous set of expertise in neuroscience, which is also about thinking. And so, not only about thinking, but that's a lot of what neuroscience is about. So I suggested that we actually organize this initiative around the kind of intersection between AI, neuroscience, and the humanities, which is also a place where thinking about thinking happens very robustly in philosophy, in literary studies, and history. So the idea behind the initiative was really to do two things. One, actually, is just to bring people on UCLA campus into dialogue with each other across engineering, neuroscience, and the humanities. Because you would think this happens all the time, but it really doesn't. It's a big place. We sometimes don't even see our own colleagues down the hall for months on end, right? And so really bringing people who might not have conversations with each other into conversation with each other. And it takes work to do that, so we do that on a regular basis. But the other is actually to sort of try and look for interesting overlaps between these three areas of neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and humanities. And you can't always find all three of them in the room in the same way, but just to give you an example, we had a really interesting discussion between a computer scientist and a neuroscientist, where the computer scientist basically admitted that he had no idea how his AI models work, right? That he's created them but doesn't understand how they work. And maybe the neuroscientist had some cool tools for trying to figure out what his AI was doing. And it actually comes back to the grandma neurons. We had a really interesting discussion about something called place neurons, which are a similar hypothesized neuron that are associated, that light up in the brain when place is mentioned. And so there was a great back and forth between them on that topic of how to think about how to analyze what an AI is doing using tools from neuroscience. And you would think it would go the other direction, but this was actually a surprising reversal of that. So we're looking for projects like that we can fund either as events like this or as research projects. And so hopefully we'll have a lot more on the horizon.
Very interesting. And are there any research projects of your own you want to mention?
Oh, well, not so much in this area. I've been actually thinking a lot about the history of the internet as a kind of, it's a bit of a combination of nostalgia and concern for artificial intelligence, and thinking about what we can learn from what happened with the arrival of the internet for what's about to happen with AI. So I do have a project where I'm trying to draft that into a book.
We'll take your questions shortly, but before we do, I want to ask one more question, coming back to where we started about costs and benefits. So, any additional thoughts about how we can harness the power of AI without having it destroy our lives and our careers?
I think, in line with what I think it's conversations like this one, to be honest, not to be like hokey about it. But AI is a conversational interface, and I think having these types of engagements, these types of conversations, finding ways to continue to have these conversations among ourselves, but also with our technical infrastructures, and continuing that process of critical, skeptical engagement, but in a Socratic mode, right, to continue questioning these things, because they change so fast that there's not a quick answer to anything. We don't know what next year is going to look like. But I think that we can think about...
Or even tomorrow.
Or even tomorrow, right? But what we can future-proof maybe is a critical perspective on the world around us, and a serious value in the art of conversation and sharing knowledge.
And I would add, I think in that spirit, that one of the things I'd like to see more conversations about is when we should not use AI. It's not quite the right way to put it. Yeah. I mean, there are some use cases, but I think there's a tendency to say everyone should be figuring out how to use AI for every purpose. And actually, there's a lot of things that we really just don't need it for, and it's not suited to. And we should probably be having conversations about that, as well as all the things that it can do.
Well, right here we have 3 humans and no AI, and we're not doing it.
So far as you know.
Okay, so we'll take some questions. Wait till the microphone comes before you start talking. And let's see who wants to start us off.
I have a question about what I perceive as blind spots I see all over the place. Each person I talk to in the arts, in the military, in medical, sees that all the things AI can do everywhere else, but in their own area, there's a human, and they'll never quite compete with the human. Professor Kelty, you said something in that line about something that can do something not quite as good as you, but a lot faster, a lot of it. And it's kind of a thought I want to throw out there. Your comment on blind spots, do they exist, and why?
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, I do think there's a lot of, as we say, low-hanging fruit, right? Like an AI is going to be much better at doing some basic calculations than a human, right? Because computers are better at doing basic calculations, right? But what's, I think, really interesting is, as good as these things get, the place where it requires a human and an AI working together to come up with something that neither of them could see in the first place, those are the ones we should grab onto and say, okay, this is what it's good for, I think. That's where we want to focus our attention. Rather than sort of continuously trying to benchmark humans as if they are limited beings in all kinds of ways and therefore, we will eventually surpass everything, we should be thinking about where that collaboration produces something neither the AI or the human could do on their own. I don't know if that's a blind spot, but it's definitely the place where I would look if people aren't looking there. Right?
Wait for the mic.
If we haven't ever tried this, what program would you think would be fun to just give it a try?
Oh, absolutely. I encourage this is one of the core parts of my classes. A lot of students they're humanities students, they've never used AI, they haven't used the latest technical tools, but they're so intuitive. And right now you can just talk to them. But the core part that I say is that you can read 1,000 think pieces about AI or listen to 1,000 podcasts, but I think having a direct engagement will give you an understanding of what it is in a way that none of those think pieces are ever going to make sense of for you. So I heartily encourage opening it up and tinkering with it. They're built to be intuitive, and I think the results would be surprising.
Is there one in particular that you would be the starter?
Who's paying you?
And I mean, yeah, there's a lot. So I could say UCLA is partnered with Copilot, which is the Microsoft's implementation of a lot of OpenAI tools. So ChatGPT, I think, is useful. And I actually teach this in my class as something. It is like maybe one of the most prominent, definitely the most publicly visible platform, which also means that it's maybe the most important one to critique.
Yeah.
So we study these platforms not just because they're the most noble and unattached, but because they are important to think about. And so I think ChatGPT is the one that's probably most important to think about.
There's a Washington Post article, I think, or maybe it's the Wall Street Journal article actually just recently that's comparing 5 of these chatbots, almost like 5 restaurants or 5 lawnmowers or whatever, and they have a very interesting set of criteria for this. Do you want one that's going to tell you exactly what you want to hear? Do you want to, they're sort of different things that they test them on. So you can.
What are the 1 or 2 favorites?
One that they said came up at the top was perplexity, which is one that I had not played with at all. And then there were, they each scored differently on different criteria.
And these are going to be there, whether or not you want to play with them. Like Google, for example, Gemini is already being rolled out to all of its searches.
Yeah.
So you're already going to start seeing, whether or not you go looking for it, it will find you.
Yeah, it's like that old olive call thing, you're soaking in it.
If you had a high-level chat GPT available at this meeting, sitting on the table, what kind of questions would it ask you after listening to this discussion?
I don't think it would know who I am.
You could find out. We're going to post the video. You could post the video and then ask it to come up with some follow-up questions.
Maybe we should have.
Yeah. Totally. Chat, the 4.0 can now use voice and hear, right? So we could have set it up here as a third panelist. Maybe we should do another round.
And this is why and this is why I think actively experimenting and playing with these tools is so important, because we could speculate what it could do. But I think the specificity of we could have just set it up. The specificity of what it would have done could have been really fascinating. It probably it's very good at synthetic pattern recognition and seeing what's covered and not. So it'd be really good at noticing all the blind spots. Like I bet ChatGPT could rattle off a dozen blind spots that are really important that we missed in our
It
conversation.
could be far more interesting than either of us, and I apologize for that.
I prefer having the 2 of you.
When I hear about things like ChatGPT, I hear about training it as large language models. So I'm wondering if there's a component that would be a large video model. That is, can ChatGPT and AI in general be trained on videos and look at the world, tell you what's going on, and predict what might happen next?
Yeah. Also already exists. So tools like DALL-E, Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, these are tools that are trained on massive amounts of video and can produce, starting really with just still images, but increasingly Sora, which is OpenAI's version of this, can produce up to 1 minute of pretty realistic looking video. And it does it in largely the same way, but the issues are very different because language is different than visual material. But you can definitely play with producing images just using a text prompt that says, show me an image of a chicken crossing the road, and it'll do it.
And I'll add that, so we always large language models are multimodal because they work in multiple modes, and a large language model that has more language, let's say no video data or no image data, shockingly performs more poorly than a large language model that's just language that's far bigger. So like there's something about the way in which, and again we don't fully understand this, but the way in which multimodal large language models map the language onto sound, image, or moving image that actually makes their language aspect function better. So there's an interesting feedback loop between these things, but I think that's really where, I mean, they become these fully multimedia machines that are relating all of the sensory input that we have together.
Anybody else? Incoming president of the Faculty Club's board of directors.
I heard an interesting thing recently when I was taking a workshop over in Bulger Hall about AI, and the person who was teaching the workshop made the comment that he had heard Terence Tao. Do you all know
Yes.
Terence Tao is our
world's greatest mathematician?
Yeah, I mean, he's just absolutely brilliant. And that he predicted that within the next year, AI would receive co-author credit on some of the work that he's doing. Because I guess he can ask AI to do the calculations on something. You were talking about folding protein and how it's very complex and all this. But you can ask AI to do that part and give it the prompt to check its work. And maybe that'll be a co-author credit.
Well, you heard Professor Tao say that.
I didn't hear him say it myself, but the instructor who was teaching this class mentioned it. He also mentioned that in astronomy, I hope I'm getting this completely right, but that you could ask AI to review the abstracts of the 300 top astronomy journals and summarize, the important things for you, which seems like, an academe. Think about it, it's like, that'd save you some time.
These are really amazing capacities, and I think your concern about the co-authorship thing has so many different angles to it. But I think one thing that's important about that is that the reason we have authorship in the first place is this particular model genius, basically, right? That the person who is named as the author there was the person who did all the work, and that's almost never true, right? And I'm probably willing to say it's never true. But we have a lot invested in the idea that that's how new ideas come into being. So what's interesting in this case is why give ChatGPT credit and not your Illumina sequencing machine, right? Which also does a whole lot of work for you when you have a publication about genetic sequences, for instance, right? So there's something people are attributing a little bit of liveliness to ChatGPT that they wouldn't to other machines.
That's true. Any concluding comments, Dr. Snelson, Dr. Kelty?
Oh, no, this is what I was going to add, just on this time really quickly about that there was a scandal in the scientific community. This feels very transparent at least. There's a scandal built around this sentence that I really love, as of my last knowledge update. This is something that ChatGPT does when it answers something. And you could find how many scientists in published journals were using ChatGPT by searching for that string, and it showed up hundreds of times. Right, so many scientists have already been collaborating with ChatGPT, obviously. And so I'm really interested in these mores and how they transform, how they change, how we think about transparency, and I think that really important questions that Chris is saying around authorship and how we've historically conceived of authorship and why we conceived of it that way.
So I'll say, one thing we haven't really talked about here, and that is a very live concern for a lot of people who look at this stuff, is issues of things like bias in these models, and how bias is related to things like race and racialization, and how you ask a ChatGPT model to tell you about a president, and it always tells you about a male president, that kind of thing, right? And there's a lot of work going into solving those problems and trying to figure it out. But I think the thing that I have have been thinking about this issue is we really live in an imperfect world, and these models are built out of that imperfect world. It's really a mirror. It's not, you know, some other thing that came from nowhere. It's reflecting what we are. And if we want a different world, we have to work on creating that, not just hoping that we can make the model represent a world we don't live in.
Very wise man, so he's no better than we are.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful place to conclude. I know.
Dr. Kelty,
I just want to say a couple words and I can project. This is our 9th UCLA Conversation that we've had this academic year. So we just wanted to say a bit of gratitude to you, Stuart, for organizing all these conversations with the faculty and the staff here. They've been incredible and educational. And for Michael Heafy, who's done our AD work. So this will be on our YouTube channel later. We have just a small gift, and I wrote some notes, not from AI, but from my actual brain. So thank you both for going above and beyond. Your teamwork and working with the Retirees Association and the Emeriti Association. These programs have only enhanced our communal efforts with retirees on and off campus and our YouTube channel. So thank you so much for this academic season, and we look forward to working with you both again in the future. So thank you all for coming today, and I have a little gift for you and
thank you, Aisha. Thank you, Michael.